I had the coolest job that any electrical engineer could ever have on the ground crew for Solar Impulse 2, the first solar-powered airplane to fly around the world only using the power of the sun. IEEE USA has given me a competitive edge because of their support system. It is so much easier doing something and being out of your comfort zone when you have someone there saying, "You got this." IEEE USA is more than just a network. It's a family.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to today's IEEE USA Livestream webinar, How to Become a Technical Storyteller. I'm your host, Jonathan Cho. IEEE USA's goal is to create programming that is valuable, relevant, and of interest to you. We'll be sending a short survey to all registrants after this event and would love your feedback. We value your opinions and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes and share your thoughts. Our presenter for today is IEEE member Paige Kassalen. Excuse me. As some of you may have noticed, she is in fact the one who is featured in our IEEE USA is my competitive edge video just now. Paige loves to put her creativity on use by solving problems in emerging technical fields and currently uses those skills at Crowd AI, an artificial intelligence startup, where she leads the implementation of computer vision solutions for existing commercial customers. She's been listed in the prestigious Forbes 30 Under 30 list and has been featured in publications like Glamour, Fast Company, and the Huffington Post, and is also an IEEE USA Inside contributor. Everyone, please welcome Paige Kassalen. Afternoon, Paige. Glad to have you with us.
Yes, thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm happy to be here with you all today and sharing some insight around how to become a technical storyteller. So just jumping right in, let's start and talk about why does this matter? We can probably all think of an experience we've had where we're communicating a message and looking around the room and starting to see that, either some people have a confused look on their face or some people are asking questions that aren't necessarily relevant to the message we're trying to communicate. So it's really important to remember that the goal is not to just communicate the message, but to make sure that that message is received. To do that, today we're going to talk through 5 key steps that will help you become a technical storyteller with, again, that end goal of making sure that your messages are received. As I go through each step, I'm going to talk through really what I mean with this category and then show you a few examples. We're going to talk about things like choosing the best medium for communicating your message, reminding the audience about what you're talking about, letting the slide do the work for the audience, building a document that speaks for itself, and then ending on quantifying everything. I want to make sure that after I go through all of these points, I save enough time for questions and answers. So if you have a question, definitely jot it down, and I'd be happy to have that discussion. So kicking it off with step 1, choosing the best medium for communicating your message. And this one's important because a lot of times when we think about being a technical storyteller, we think about what we want to say. But this step is all about how we're going to say that message. And this matters for a couple reasons. So the first one, we're competing for the audience's attention. I know that especially when we're in the audience seat, we have been in the position where we're receiving emails or we're receiving Slack pings from someone. Especially in a remote setting too, we'll have other distractions that could be competing for our attention, which is making it harder for us to receive that message. You also have to remember that you'll have to overcome a short attention span. So especially because people are being pulled in multiple directions, you have to focus on not just grabbing someone's attention, but maintaining it. Finally, the medium you choose can really increase the credibility and trustworthiness of your message. An easy example could be, if you're reporting out the results from a project that you're working on and you decide to just send an email with everything in one big block of text, no bolding, no paragraph breaks, it's not going to come across as trustworthy as if it were in a properly documented slide deck or a Confluence document that others in your company can refer to. So before jumping into an example of choosing different mediums, I just want to highlight that there are so many mediums out there. In this presentation, I'm going to use PowerPoint slide decks as an example because that's what my stakeholders tend to respond to best but it's all about understanding how your message is going to be received. So if your company works well with very well commented Python code, make sure that you're using that medium to communicate your message. And be willing to get out of the box of your comfort level for what you tend to communicate with. All right, on this slide, we have two examples. So on the left, this is an example of the Word document I wrote for an article on this topic, how to become a technical storyteller, that I published on the IEEE USA Insight career column. And this is the medium that was best for that type of audience, right? Because they were reading a column on a website. And different things you can do is, like I had mentioned, bolding sections, having indentation, having enough paragraph breaks. It allows your audience, especially if they're pulled in another direction, to know where they left off. And I wanted to put this example up here because even though what I'm communicating right now is the same message, using a Word document like this, of course, wouldn't be the best medium for this type of audience. You know, if I just scrolled through and it was a big block of text, I would probably struggle maintaining everyone's attention and the message wouldn't be received. Instead, something like we see over in the right, where you're having a slide deck that has very clear chunks of information, why and how, why to do this and how to do that. You also have some images that could visually show your audience what you're talking about when it comes to a medium. And in the bottom here in the green, there are a few things to remember, and I've been highlighting these a bit, but really when you're choosing a medium, hone in on what your audience responds to. And this, again, is very important because it's not about just communicating, but making sure that message is received. The other piece is finding something that will be dynamic and allow you to break up text. I know even for myself, no matter how well a message, or no matter how important a message is, it's sometimes really hard to just focus on a large block of text. Finding a way to make it easier for your audience to digest will just increase the effectiveness of that message. For this point, I also wanted to include a couple final notes because there are some challenges to look out for. The first one, your audience's preferred medium might be different from your own. So a perfect example right now is that in previous jobs, I've used email to communicate most of the time, but my current organization uses Slack. If I was just sending emails back and forth to people, then messages might have been missed, and no matter how well I tried to communicate over email, if people aren't using that channel to communicate, it's not going to be an effective storytelling. Instead, using what your audience responds to is going to make sure your message is received. The second piece, so you might not think you have an eye for design, and I wanted to include this in here because especially as technical professionals, and myself included, I don't have experience in graphic design, but don't let that stop you from communicating your message in the most effective way possible. My advice for anyone that isn't sure if they have that eye for design to really craft a visually pleasant story, look and see what your colleagues are using. If you see someone that is communicating a message in a really nice way that you see the audience responds to, ask them to send it to you. Then just use that as a skeleton and put in your information. The final piece, so you might not save enough time to strategize about how to communicate this message. And this one's really important as well because a lot of times we're so focused on doing all of the work that we forget we have to communicate it. When I posted my article, the initial article I wrote for the Insight column, I received a question from someone and they were saying, you know, what about research papers, right? You spend years to months doing research and then you have to pare it down into one final document. And a research paper is a perfect example of why it's so important to strategize about how you want to communicate your message. And it's important because no matter how much work you've put in, no matter how good your results are, if you're not communicating it in the way that's most effective for that message to be received, the information that you're sharing won't have the impact that it could have. All right, so now that we talked about in what way and how you're going to communicate that message, we can start talking about how to actually become that technical storyteller. So the second step is reminding the audience what you're talking about. And let me explain what I mean here. So let's start on the left. Why does it matter? We're all very close to the information that we're presenting, but your stakeholder a lot of times is not. I know, especially if I'm giving a weekly update, for example, to someone, they might not have heard about the topic or thought about the topic since the last update. So including and reminding the audience what you're talking about gives everyone a moment to reacclimate to the topic before jumping in. What you're doing here is basically priming your audience to be able to receive your message. And then your audience will be able to follow along much easier and then help you to achieve your decision quicker. Another key point too about why it's important to remind your audience what you're talking about is that people will join in meetings along the project life cycle. So someone that wasn't there from the start might come in halfway through and you need to catch them up quickly. So reminding the audience what you're talking about and always level setting on the goals of the project will help you more effectively get your audience ready to receive the message. And there's a couple ways you can do this. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about or show an intro slide for project background that I include at the start of all of my updates with different stakeholders. You can also just read aloud notes from the last meeting. What you're doing here is helping the audience get back in that mindset they were during the last update and then get them ready for the discussion today. Another point is to just pause after the first few minutes and make sure everyone's on the same page. This is important, especially in a remote setting, because you don't get that physical feedback from being in a room full of people to understand if they're aligned with what you're saying or not. So just pausing and saying, hey, does anyone have any questions? Are we ready to move on? Will go a long way and give your audience the time they need if they need to ask questions. All right, as I promised, an example background slide. So like I said, every time I have an update with a stakeholder, I always start with this project overview background slide. And one note is that it will kind of feel uncomfortable to share something like this at the start of every update because you're so close to the project. So you're thinking you're just repeating redundant information, but your audience won't think it's redundant. They're going to appreciate the fact that you're reminding them what you're talking about and helping them get ready to take action in this meeting. A few key points to include. So always start with the overarching objective of the project. Don't just say what you're trying to do, but explain why you're trying to do it as well. I know throughout projects, sometimes the scope can move in different directions, and one way to control any scope creep is clearly stating that objective every single time you're meeting. Another thing that's really important is calling out any prior work or rationale for completing the project. This is important because organizations will pause and pick up projects years apart. And especially if someone's trying to refer to documentation that happened years ago on a project, it's really good to remind people what the assumptions were, why the work was being done, and any other background work that they should be considering. Moving down, we have this approach section. Showing the project status in relation to an overall timeline is really helpful for your audience because they are able to understand where you are at the current in the current project, but then also that reminder of what has been done and what is still coming. It also allows people to have that clear transparency into the timeline and how long it will take to get the final result. The last piece of information I want to share here is, again, since I said it can be sometimes hard to go through a project overview slide and then be at this bird's eye view and get down to the day-to-day topics that you're trying to focus on. Having a discussion point or ending with discussion points is really helpful because it lets your audience know what you're talking about today and also transitions from that bird's eye view into the meeting objective. So to conclude this point, I want to share again that it could feel a little bit uncomfortable to reiterate this message to your audience because you're so close to the project, but they're going to appreciate it. You also don't have to spend 10 minutes on a slide like this. Even if you spend the first 3 minutes and say something like, to level set on the topic before jumping in, let's just quickly review these points. This is what we're trying to talk about today. Done. I can guarantee that your audience will appreciate it and it will make you a stronger technical storyteller. All right, so now talking about the bulk of the messaging that you're going to give. Step 3 is letting the slide do the work for the audience. I mentioned a couple slides ago that I use slide decks a lot because that's what my stakeholders respond to best, but you can substitute the word slide here for Word document, Excel document, Confluence page, any type of medium. To explain what I mean here by letting the slide do the work for your audience, here's a bad example. And you guys might be wondering, why is this a bad example? Because it's a graph, you have some colors, it's big, people can see it. So the reason this isn't the strongest example of how to display information is because you're not controlling the message the audience is receiving. If I asked 5 of you on this call to tell me the main takeaways from this graph, I'd probably get 5 different answers. You know, some people might look and say, oh, product 1 has the most sales and product 3 has the least. Instead, do something like this. These type of call-out boxes allow your audience to know where they should be focusing their attention. And you're telling them the takeaway they should be getting from a graph. The graph is really just supporting it and providing that data, but then the takeaway is that message they're trying to receive. Here in the first call-out box, we have product 2 more than doubled its sales in quarter 2 compared to quarter 1. If we just look at this slide, right, you might not have had that takeaway, but that was the most important thing you wanted to communicate. And this allows you to control that message your audience is receiving. Another component is having proper axis labels and title. I know I probably sound like a broken record saying this too, because so many times, I know especially in education, they say, label your graphs, put a title on it. But it really is important because you're building a document that is not just for the presentation or the communication you're doing today, but it's going to be referred to down the road. Over here, where you have the quarters and specifying that the quarters are for 2021, that allows your audience to know when this data is from. And it just allows them to then be able to build upon that information in the future. And this build upon topic leads us into the next point. So building a document that speaks for itself. All right, another bad example. So the status quo used to be when communicating, especially in a presentation, to just have big, bold text and limit the number of words if possible. A slide used to be just something that was supposed to be a placeholder and then go with the voiceover from your presentation. As I mentioned, that was the previous status quo, but building a slide that can speak for itself and not require that voiceover allows others to be able to build off your work months or years later. Also, people who didn't attend the presentation can understand what happened. So we're working across different time zones a lot of time. Other teams are trying to leverage our work. Not everyone can always be in a meeting. By building a slide that you can just send to someone and doesn't require you to explain every detail, increases the impact that your work can have. It also makes sure that people are receiving that message you were trying to tell. Because if you give a slide to someone else and they're trying to communicate it and the main takeaways, things could get lost in translation. One other point up here too is that even people that were in the meeting will appreciate a slide that speaks for itself because it allows them to not have to worry about taking too many notes, and they could focus on listening and receiving that information you're sharing. So how to build a document that speaks for yourself. In the next slide, I'm going to share another example of what this means, but what I like to think of is creating more of a science fair poster instead of just a slide. And I'll show you what I mean in that next slide, but it's also important to include footnotes to answers like, where is this data from? What assumptions were made? Any things that you think are important for your audience to know when they're looking at the slide, definitely make sure to include. Finally, building on a point we already talked about, including a background slide is very helpful, especially if this document is going to be shared with other people, because they're able to get the context of the project really quickly and then get the value of the message you're trying to share. And this is what I mean whenever I say something like a science fair poster. So you have different sections. You have the high-level takeaways. What is somebody supposed to know about this project? You also highlight the methodology. And this is important, especially on a results slide, because if you're sharing results without the methodology, people might have trouble buying in. You need to show them that these were the steps I took for them to agree with the results and the main takeaways. One thing I included here too, and this is building upon that last step of letting the slide do the work for your audience, is tying the two bullet points, the small circles for 1 and 2, to the graphs. Just allow your audience to spend less time trying to figure out what these graphs correspond to and what the value is. And it doesn't always have to just be on one slide, but it's always important to include next steps, even if it's the end of a project, because you want to showcase how your work can be leveraged in respect to other things. So if it's building upon the work, if it's getting more funding to do something, whatever the next steps are be, make sure to call out, because your audience needs to know what their call of action is. All right, so we are getting towards the end of the 5 steps for becoming a technical storyteller. And this one is the cherry on top. So this slide and this section of slides are all about quantifying everything. And as I mentioned, it is the cherry on top, because this is the way that you can take your information that you're sharing and take it from good to great. On this slide, I'm going to have these examples that I labeled as don't, and showcase some examples of what it would look like to quantify everything. And at a first glance, you might take a look at these in the left-hand side and think, you know, what's wrong with them, right? The issue has come up a lot recently. I feel like I say that a lot, and there I go, I say it a lot. The hard thing is it's a little bit unclear what a lot means. The way to take this sentence and make it stronger is to say something like this. We've seen this issue 172 times, about 86% in the last 200 samples taken from April 5th to April 20th. That sentence is so much stronger and allows your audience to really understand, number one, what does a lot mean, and then understand what they need to do to get to the root cause of this issue. The next piece, we exhausted all options for improvement, but nothing worked. If you came to a leadership team and said, and had this on your slide, we exhausted all the options, nothing worked, people's first question will be, well, what did you try? Instead of leaving that up to them to ask, just state it. To improve the performance, the team tried 15 experiments by changing variables related to data type, process setup, etc., but had no success. This is so much stronger because then it allows your audience to know, hey, they already looked at all of these things. Let's try a different variable. Did you think about asking for support from this team? Did you think about reducing processing time? Anything. The final piece is that this project was successful. Project success is always good, but to make this stronger, you could say something like, this project can be considered a success because we maximized performance in the 3 target areas and finished up under budget. This is really helpful because you're defining success for your audience. And especially if we're talking about documenting our work and building something that can be used on its own and built off of later, people will know what success meant and be able to go back and then build upon your work. All right, and a final note on quantifying everything. Quantifying everything will definitely take more time, but it will help your audience arrive at a conclusion faster. I know that there have been times where I see myself typing many times or infrequently and then realize, you know what, I should define what that actually means. Because again, if we just hop back to this slide, right, and the first green point above, where when you explain and quantify what the issue is, the audience knows exactly how to react. The next piece is a lot of words are fine if they add value. So this goes back to that slide I was talking about with the big results and no other information. Not having that supporting evidence on a slide makes it harder for, again, people to build off of, but also people to really receive that message you're trying to say. If you include more words, but the message is extremely valuable and they can use it to further their work, then more words are fine. The final bullet is your message will come across more credible because you'll clearly put things into perspective. Perspective is exactly what we're talking about when we say quantify everything. It happens all the time where people say, oh, we had an error every single time we tried this. Well, how many times did you try it? How many errors did you get? Will help you put into perspective how big of a problem is this and is it necessary to act now? All right, so I know that I just went through and provided those examples of each point, but the one thing I want you to remember is that the goal of becoming a technical storyteller should be to make sure your message is received. We spend so much time thinking about what we want to say, but we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the audience and really focus on making sure the message is received. Step 1, choosing the medium that's best for communicating your message. Your preferred methodology for communication might differ from your audience's, but if you want to make sure that that message is received, you need to adopt what they respond to. Step 2, remind the audience what you're talking about. Not everyone is as close to the project as you are. And this is something I remind myself of all the time. Starting slow, bringing people up to speed and priming them for the conversation we're about to have will allow them to be able to help you and achieve the goal of the meeting much quicker. Step 3, let the slide do the work for the audience. Call out boxes, ensure that the audience receives the message you are trying to say. I know that that's so interesting to be able to think about actually controlling and making sure that your message is being received, but call out boxes, using titles, using axis labels is the best way to really take away any ambiguity for what message they're receiving. Step 4, building a document that speaks for themselves. So your document should be able to be referenced months or years later without a voiceover. It's going to make sure that your work has the largest impact that it can, and then also save you time from having to give a presentation multiple times. And then the final step, step 5, quantifying everything. Don't forget, a lot of words are fine if they add value. You want to be like that column I had in the green, where you're clearly stating what the problem is or what the outcome of something was, and giving your audience those data points needed to make a decision. All right, so with that, that's the end of my presentation. I'm very glad that I was able to share all of those steps with you and very interested to further this discussion and see what questions you have.
Fantastic, Paige. Great presentation. Thank you. So, folks, we are at the Q&A segment of the webinar. Please post your questions in the comment section, and we'll load them onto the stream for Paige to answer. So, Paige, before we move on to audience questions, I do have a few questions of my own that I'd like to ask. So first, you've mentioned you've given our audience a lot of tips on how to be able to properly communicate their messages across, especially when it comes to you know documents and slides and writing in general. So how so my question, can you ever present too much information in your I guess supporting evidence or writing or presentations, or uh, opposite of that, can you present too little? I know there is seems to be some discourse between people when it comes to thinking about slides in particular, whether you should be minimalist and just have images and then just any supporting evidence in without any writing. And then on the other side of the argument, I think there's thought that you should not have too many or have a lot more information, be less minimalist, if that makes sense. But
Yeah.
like, can you have too much or too little?
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And I think that the biggest thing is, again, thinking back to what message is your audience trying to receive. It's very important to understand, are you presenting to a group of stakeholders that have to make a decision on the information I'm sharing, and something where you're giving a speech to a bunch of people about, like even something like this, how to how to become a technical storyteller. I know in the work setting where someone's trying to make a decision, I think that the more details that are relevant to share, the better, just because you want to make sure that they have all the facts.
Mhm.
And it's a hard line to balance because one of the things too is that when we're so close to our work, we get attached to every single detail that we want to share every single detail, but you really just have to think and pull out those little tokens of value for your audience and try to limit the number of words with still having very impactful messaging.
Absolutely. Great insight. And going back to your presentation and your slides, you did give some great examples of good and bad examples of slides. So I really love that. Thank you. So my next question is, how important is knowing your audience when it comes to making your presentation or presenting any technical information? And do you have any techniques to help tailor your writing for a specific audience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's extremely important to know your audience. And that's why my first step was all about how to choose the best medium. And the main takeaway there is that you need to know what your audience is going to respond to. So you have to communicate in a way that people are going to pay attention to, people are going to even read if you're sending it to them over email. So knowing your audience and knowing what you respond to is just going to maximize the impact your message has. And I would say some techniques for how you can tailor for different audiences and even know what they want is never be afraid to ask them. I know just the other day I had a conversation with someone I work with and said, do you tend to like having meetings back to back, or do you like space between them? And I know that's not necessarily about communicating things, but I was thinking more about what is needed for that person to be ready to receive the message I'm saying. Like, do you need some time, or are you ready to jump into it? So never being afraid to ask, and also don't be afraid to experiment. So if you see other people sharing information in a certain way and you want to try it, or if you see that that person that you're trying to share something with is using a technique that's a little different than yours, try to adopt it. Be flexible with the way you're communicating, and you'll eventually land on that area for how your audience will respond well.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely takes some trial and error to kind of get to know that kind of stuff. Thank you. So let's move on to our audience questions. This first question, statement-ish. So our audience member Jack says, Paige, can you comment on the use of templates for comprehension and ease of, and for familiarity versus the template becoming stale and less interesting to the audience?
Yeah, so templates are interesting because, of course, you don't want to be even to like have too much animation or be kind of too cheesy with your templates. But I think that one thing that was important that I shared with some colleagues I was working with is that if you're experimenting with templates, especially if it's in a work situation, your audience is used to seeing information displayed in a certain way. So if you change up the template that you're using and it's really far away from the status quo of what they're used to, then they might not be able to focus as much on your message as they are focusing on the template. So I know that I'm kind of taking this question in an interesting way, but I think making sure your information is presented in a formal visual way will increase that credibility, but you never want that way you're presenting something to take away from that actual message you're sharing.
Absolutely great insight. Thank you, Jack. Hope that answers your or has helped. This next question. Oops, sorry, that's not a question. This next question, Gabe Paletti. I'm not entirely sure if this is directed towards you or if, me, but Gabe asks, what software are you using for us to see the slides? If that's directed towards me, Gabe, our IEEE USA uses a live streaming platform called StreamYard. It's free with some paid features if you'd like. It allows us to see both the presenters and the slides on the screen at the same time. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Otherwise, Paige, I think you said you use PowerPoint for most of your presentations or for slides.
Yeah, I'm just using PowerPoint for these slides, and I know that I've used StreamYard in the past with IEEE, and I think that it does make for a really dynamic presentation because you're able to share that info, but then also see the speaker well.
Yeah, definitely. We found much use to it. Gabe, hope that answers your question. If not, if you could just send us a clarification on your question. Thanks again. So this next question, any tips for doing technical demonstrations or experiments as part of a presentation?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good question and something that I do in my job all the time. I would say a couple tips for doing technical demonstrations are to, the first thing is to, again, focus on your audience. So I know that there have been times I've been giving a demonstration and I realize I'm taking really long in a certain area and not haven't showed a portion that I think is really cool. But instead of trying to cram it all in and rush through it, it's usually better to take that step back and let your audience have enough time to process the information and ask questions. And if you don't get through everything, set up a follow-up meeting. So remember that the technical demonstration is as much about showcasing the work that you're doing, but also making sure that the audience is really receiving all of those messages you're sharing. Another tip I would say too for technical demonstrations or experiments is there are a lot of variables that can come up, especially if it's live. So trying to control for those variables, if it's making sure, you know, like double checking that your internet connection's right or different things like that. I know that that's a little bit standard, but just trying to make sure if you're going to do something live, you're prepared if something would then go wrong. So one thing I do sometimes is if I find out something's going wrong, I'll have a video on hand of me doing the exact same demonstration or experiment that I could then just pull up.
Definitely, and I absolutely agree with you on the live connection, internet connection, especially when it comes to production, live stream production. You definitely want to test your setup and whatever you're going to be presenting a few times at least before you need to actually go live. So thank you, and thanks for the question. This next question from our audience member: what should be a typical practical length of a document considering 5 key points?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess let's give a couple examples of a Word document. How long should it be, and maybe a slide or a slide deck? How long would you think the ideal length would be for both?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think a lot of times, and it really depends on how much flexibility you have with controlling the length. I know I mentioned something around research papers. It's sometimes hard to pare those down into just the one page or one slide or something. But what I like to think of, especially when I'm writing articles for IEEE USA Insight, I like to think about, how long can I hold someone's attention? So even if I have really important information that I want to include, if my document's starting to get more than 700 words, I'm realizing that I'm going to lose people's attention, and I need to put all of the information I can in the restricted area. So I think that, I know this doesn't necessarily directly answer it, but just thinking about what your audience is willing to pay, or how long your audience's attention span is, and what is their appetite for receiving something that's very long. The other thing you can also do is, especially if this is in a slide deck, if you would have 5 key points and either 5 slides for it or 1 major summary slide, you can have the appendix that would allow for that more detail. So if somebody needs the information, they could always reference it, but it's not that main focus of what you're sharing. I hope that helps.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and this kind of goes back to the too much, too little information question. Don't want to make it too long and risk drawing or having the audience's attention drawn away. So definitely great answer. Thank you. And I guess this next question kind of goes back to a similar question that, or my question. Any advice on understanding the audience and their preferred medium?
Mhm.
So it just, I guess, a little, just a summary of what you mentioned before.
Yeah, I think so. Along things that I was mentioning around, you know, seeing what other people are sharing, it's also important just to keep your eyes and ears open and seeing how people that are your colleagues or on your team or in different departments are presenting or communicating back and forth can help you get an understanding of how you should be communicating. I also think, and I mentioned this, but it's never a problem asking. And if you don't want to ask your stakeholder directly, you can always ask someone else who has experience with that stakeholder. And I would say too, one thing, if you're communicating with the stakeholder directly, don't just say, "Hey, how do you want this presented?" Because you're not communicating that message in the best way either. You could say, "Hey, I want to make sure that what I'm sharing is going to be in line with expectations. What is the typical medium," or something. Yeah, definitely never be afraid to ask.
Definitely, thank you, and thank you to our audience member who, for some reason, your name isn't showing up, but I believe it's our Timothy from LinkedIn. So thanks for the question, Timothy. This next question, Zeke asks, do you have any advice on noticing during a presentation that your audience needs more detail or needs less detail, and how do you adjust for that?
Yeah, yeah. Hey, Zeke. So this is a great question, and I think that something that's really important is giving those pauses and taking those breaks for your audience to digest the information and just asking, like, "Hey, are you good? Did you understand what I'm talking about?" I know that another thing too is if you're starting to hear crickets and no one's responding to your messages or your questions that you're asking, maybe that's a time to take that step back and start realizing maybe you need to re-explain something.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it definitely is a skill that you need to build upon when trying to come up with things on the fly or change things on the fly for sure. So yeah, definitely. Thank you. And thanks for the question, Zeke. This next question, audience member asks, what tool do you recommend for us to use when designing slides, especially for those who have no eye for design?
Yeah, this is a great question, and this is exactly why I put that eye for design as part of the presentation, because one of the hardest things, you know what message you want to say, but it's just not coming out right on your slide. And I think that using other like well-communicated messages or documents that your colleagues have is really helpful. But I also think just if you search on Google and like look for different ways to construct slides, you might be able to make something that looks similar. It definitely takes a lot of time coming up with a good design for your slides, but I think with more practice and more exposure to how other people communicate, it will become much easier, and it makes your message more credible in the end. So it's a hurdle to overcome, but it's definitely worth it.
A great tip, definitely. And I feel like design, the word design and the concept of design in general, it's so subjective. And everyone has their own like eye for design just may not be the same as another person. So I feel like getting another person's, I guess maybe testing it out, presenting your information, your slides to someone else might be a good way of getting an idea if your design works with a particular audience. So definitely. And thanks for the question. This next question, Dan asks, how do you feel about slide automation? Is it too gimmicky or effective at controlling the message?
Yeah, this is a good question, and something I even thought about for this presentation. Slide automation definitely helps you a lot of times time box the amount of time you're spending in different areas. I know depending really on what type of presentation you're trying to give, like for example, a presentation to a lot of people where maybe you're talking or sharing your experience with students. That could be a great option for slide automation because you know that your audience isn't going to raise their hands and ask questions or want you to clarify something. I think that really the key is trying to make sure you're not distracting the audience from the main message. So if you're using automation or animation to really focus your audience's attention on a certain point, it's really helpful. But yeah, definitely make sure you're not distracting.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to put too much animation, I guess. Or at least if you need to, don't speak at the same time. I absolutely agree. Thank you. Um, so our audience member James asks, can you comment about the use of backup slides for potential deep, detailed dives? I found them to be if useful to be I found them useful to be prepared for controversial discussions based on data and results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think backup slides are great. And I know that a lot of times, right, you are doing so much work and not everything's going to make it into that main presentation. But having backup slides in your appendix to refer to does a lot of things for you. So it allows you to go into those deep dives, just as you mentioned, James, but it also showcases your credibility because you show that you've done so much work besides just what is shown on these slides, and you're able to support all the questions being asked. I think, you know, the more backup slides you can prepare, the better. But from my experience too, sometimes you're in a time crunch and you're not able to prepare everything. So never feel hesitant to set up a follow-up discussion with someone and give yourself more time to prepare for a specific topic.
Definitely. Thank you. And to our audience, I do apologize if there's some shifting of of the slides or the webcams around. I accidentally pressed the button. Okay, great. So this next question, kind of a long one. Paige, what do you suggest in a scenario where your stakeholder takes a different direction with your presentation than what you've prepared, such as a scope of work change of agenda, etc.?
Yeah, yeah. Hey, Carly. So yeah, this is huge, and I know that depending on personalities in meetings, you'll sometimes have that stakeholder that is dead set on going in one direction, even though you're trying to go in another. I think that a lot of times this scenario can go in different ways. You can either go along with that stakeholder, or you can say, hey, I'm not officially prepared to discuss this today. It's not in the information I prepared. Let's set up a follow-up meeting. Or you can, field it on the fly. I'd say one thing that helps a lot of times that I tried to highlight a bit in the presentation is stating different things. Like, so with the methodology, if you have the result, also include the methodology, because when people say, did you try this? You're able to say, well, these are the steps I followed, and yes, it was here in step number 5. I think, you can never prepare for how a stakeholder is going to take the meeting, but just making sure that you're strong and in control of the presentation and willing to adapt on the fly is helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like going back to what you said, having the methodology, definitely being able to have some rebuttal points is should be pretty important, especially when it comes to when others want to make changes in your presentations for sure. Thanks for the question, Carly. This next question, Marisol asks, any tips on how to make a good slide template for a research lab group?
Yeah, I wonder, I'm trying to think through this because I'm not sure exactly the research lab group specific things and what you would be wanting to communicate there. But I think really Google is always your best friend, and using it as kind of an idea board even and combining different things you see works. I think really using that methodology of almost creating a science fair poster and having different sections broken up to highlight different pieces of information really showcases the credibility of all the work that you've done and also provides enough visuals to support that work. So research and all of the work that goes into research definitely deserves really strong communication because it's just going to elevate the impact that work can have.
For sure. Thanks for the question, Marisol. Binesh on YouTube asks, when you have people with different levels of understanding of the project, how do you find a balance between sharing too much information versus for some versus too little for others?
Yeah, so this is one of those challenging things that we always face as being a technical storyteller, is that you sometimes have people in the room that are extremely ingrained in the technical side of things, and then people that are maybe in more of a sales function. I think really thinking of your audience as a whole and what people are trying to gain out of it is going to be the key here. So you might not need to go into the technical depth of the presentation if you know that the stakeholder you have from the technical side is up to speed. So maybe something you do if it's going to be a big meeting is you pull the technical stakeholder aside before and present your technical facts. You can also do something where you have different sections of like a high level overview and then a section that's really a technical deep dive, because this at least lets the technical people know that they should be focusing in this area, and it lets the other sales or business functions know that maybe this isn't a point that they have to be 100% focused for.
Great, thank you. And thanks for the question, Binesh. And I do see that we have a lot of questions from our audience. Folks, we will try and get to your questions, as many of the questions as possible before the end of the webinar. Our next question, Richard asks, did you have specific training in communication, such as college courses or Toastmaster clubs, or are there any training programs and organizations you would recommend?
Yeah. Hi, Richard. So specific training in communications, my background is in electrical engineering and then have a Master of Information Systems Management. So one thing that was stressed to me throughout my entire education, though, was really that you're going to need to communicate these technical messages. I have worked with 3 great organizations throughout my career so far that have all really prioritized communications. I know that I did take a course in Dale Carnegie technical presentations, which I thought was very helpful. Really, I think the biggest hurdle I would say people have in sometimes communicating messages is getting out of their comfort zone for how they communicate. We have all seen presentations where someone's being really dynamic and moving around and changing the inflection in their voices, but sometimes people think, oh no, I don't know if I could do that. But remembering that you're not going to embarrass yourself if you're trying and being enthusiastic and passionate about your work. It's going to really make your audience have that passion and enthusiasm as well.
Definitely. And shameless plug, IEEE is a pretty great organization to be a part of. IEEE USA in particular, since we've one of our focuses is career development. We do have a lot of resources that help with more technical professionals, building their soft skills such as communication and presentation as well. So, shameless plug. Uh, thanks for the question, Richard. Let's see. Okay, so this next question from Victor. What about formulating your communication into a narrative? Any tips on that, Paige?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm hoping I'm understanding this question correctly, but I think that telling a story and telling a narrative is exactly how you want to communicate. So even if it's something just like, hey, these are the results of my project, you want to tell a story. And the story should never be just, hey, here it is. You want to be able to say, this is what we did. This is the takeaway. Here's some examples. This is the next step. Very similar to that one slide I shared. I think just having that mindset and reminding yourself that you're telling a story and that thinking about what it would be like to be in the audience's shoes and how you could maintain their attention is exactly what you want to do.
Great insight. Thanks, Paige. This is a really interesting question, probably very relevant, especially during these times. Alyssa asks, what recommendations do you have for scripting a presentation, and how does your scripting approach differ between presenting live versus virtual?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I know a lot of times, and it depends on if it's a business presentation or a presentation like this with IEEE, but a lot of times I will take a first stab at writing out what I would like to say. And I never end up actually reading it. I just like to be able to get my thoughts out and be able to put it in a way that's going to be, that allows me to think and not just on the fly. So I would say writing a script is always great, and making sure that you're not memorizing your script or just reading the script out loud, especially virtual, is important because people can always tell that. I would say too is just remembering that what you end up saying is never going to be exactly what you planned on saying, and making sure that that's a fact from the start. Then you put less pressure on yourself to remember every single detail. I would say too, the last thing is just, it's not always about just communicating your message, but make sure your audience is receiving it. So if people are not understanding, be willing to go off script and change your approach.
Great advice. Thank you, Paige. This is a pretty important question, I think. After creating something, I find it hard to spot my errors. It all looks good to me because I created it. Can you comment on the need to have peer reviews?
Yes. Okay. So this is very important and something I know that I definitely deal with a lot, where I could be looking at something and I don't realize there's a massive misspelling. And it's because we're all so close to that information. Asking a colleague that you know is a strong communicator to take a look or to hear you go through the presentation is very helpful. I know that something I've started doing is using some of those read aloud features on Microsoft Word. I think they probably do it on PowerPoint as well, but actually hearing what it sounds like to have someone else read something to you is very helpful. Another thing about just having peer reviews too can help you realize, are you too close to the information you're sharing? Because again, things that you think are super valuable might not be as valuable for your stakeholders. So having a secondary opinion help you guide even the content of your presentation is very helpful.
Absolutely agree with that. And it doesn't even need to be for technical presentations either. It can be, I think, peer reviews are important for whatever topic or presentation that you're going to be creating. So absolutely important. And I agree. Thank you. And thanks for the question, Philip. This next question, Todd, goes back to the presentation skills or tips. Any tips on speaking skills, pacing, tone, production, or excuse me, pronunciation? Is there any advice you can provide on how to kind of practice or build up these skills?
Mhm. Yeah, I think the best thing is to think about what do you like hearing and then trying to replicate that. So again, having some passion in your voice, even if you're talking about a serious topic and giving a business presentation, you shouldn't be bored about what you're presenting. So being able to have that enthusiastic tone is important. And then one thing I know I've heard before, and I'm still, of course, perfecting all of these skills, but you should even think about your voice being on a roller coaster. So it could go up and down depending on what you're saying. It should never just be like, these are my tips on speaking skills. It should be, these are my tips on speaking skills. It just allows your audience to, again, be able to remain focused on your presentation.
It definitely, and one thing I might add to that is something that definitely helps me is whenever preparing for presentations is practicing out loud and saying it everything out loud because you can practice in your head all you want, but then a lot of times what comes out of your mouth and what goes on in your head do not always align, unfortunately, from personal experience.
Yeah, that's a
Uh yeah,
great one.
absolutely. Thanks for the question, Todd. And so, Paige, I know that we've reached the end of the hour, and we do have several more questions. Do you have time, about 10 more minutes to stay to get the rest of these questions?
Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. We'll run through this very quickly. Thank you. So this next question, um, Dr. Brendan Godfrey, how would you make a short presentation to congressional staff or where slides typically are not used?
Yeah. Hey, Brendan. Thank you so much for the question. So yeah, this is an interesting question too, because I know a lot of the times for me, it's helpful whenever I deliver a message using slides because it gives an audience something to latch on to. So if their attention gets drawn away, they can focus again, what are we talking about? But I know that this situation doesn't work for every single type of communication that we have. So I would say my tip here would be using trigger words. Like if you remember one thing, or there are three main points that I want to discuss, and then being able to, even though you can't show them on a slide, those 3 points, at least guide them through the conversation using verbal cues. You can also maybe, if you have the time, printing out a outline or printing out maybe a slide or a one-pager that you want to share. But I think if it's just a presentation that you're speaking, I would use those verbal cues like, remember this, in summary, these 3 points.
Absolutely. It can be a little daunting when you don't have access to your slides. Hopefully, that isn't that's just typical of just presenting to congressional staffers and not others in general. Thank you, Paige. This next question, Kit asks, do you have recommendations to prove accessible communication in technical storytelling so the presentations can include, excuse me, exercise inclusion and diversity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think, and I'm hoping that I'm answering your question right, but I think the way we present and communicate messages is very important for inclusion and diversity. Because, so I noticed something I even mentioned in my presentation is I said the word guys. And as soon as I said that, even though I was presenting, I realized that's not an inclusive term and I should be using you all. So being very clear about the language that you're using is important because time after time, if people are using words or phrases that aren't inclusive, it's going to set the status quo that's not welcoming to everyone. So I think for anyone who thinks that words or the way certain things are phrased isn't a big deal, it definitely is, and it's something that we all should be more mindful of.
Really great insight. Thank you, Paige. And thanks for the question, Kit. Uh, This next question, I think might be pretty important. Any tips on including jokes and humor in similar material? And I guess a little go adding on to that for myself. Should you have a bit of joke or humor in your presentations?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to remember is that you want to put yourself in the audience shoes again, right? If you don't want to sit through a presentation and be bored. So including jokes and humor, I think is totally fine if they're done in the proper manner, and also understanding again what message is your audience trying to receive from here. If it's a very serious topic, I would say, yeah, don't include jokes or humor, but there's still ways that you can just make the conversation or the presentation you're having more conversational. And that I think is the key. So being yourself and talking like you would talk to anybody is going to make the audience enjoy your presentation more, even if you're not cracking a joke or doing something. Just by using maybe even informal language sometimes can help your audience just understand that, you know, we're all normal people and this is a conversation between us two, rather than like I'm the presenter, you're the audience.
Definitely great insight. Thank you. Got a few more questions left. Andres, I hope that I'm pronouncing that right. How do you engage and read the audience when you're delivering a presentation online and your audience and you can't see the audience, or that you have or they have their cameras off during, I guess, a web conferencing platform?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is something that is becoming even more of a challenge. Giving presentations every single day in a remote setting. I would just say that, again, as we talked about, practicing and making sure that you're accounting for those things you might not be able to see. So because you can't see if somebody is confused, if their video's off, asking things like, hey, is everybody in line with this? Does anyone have questions before we move on? I think now more than ever, we have to be communicating those things more than receiving that on-demand feedback from an audience. I think also too, it's really important to, if somebody does have their camera on, still looking at the different people in the meeting, because you can start to see their head nods. And if there's one person that you're seeing is really engaged in your presentation, latch on to them, and then you could really understand and get that feedback for, is what you're saying being received?
For sure. Engagement definitely is important. And especially when it comes to using platforms like StreamYard, for instance, where we can't unfortunately see our audience. But you definitely don't want to be talking to your audience. Definitely want to talk or discuss with them, talk with them. If that makes sense. So yeah, thanks for the question. Um, this next question, Steven asks, any suggestions for preparing slide sets that may be distributed without commentary from the presenter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is all around that point I was talking about, is making sure that you're building a slide deck that can speak for itself, because especially in a remote setting, a very digital setting, people are sharing slide decks left and right. So I think really some of the tips I included in the presentation were including footnotes and really highlighting assumptions is important. I know that in a previous role, I was doing a lot of data analyses. So we would have a graph and have those main takeaways with the call outs. But one thing that I realized is I need to start incorporating, hey, when was this data pulled? Because data is changing every day. And if you don't really state all of those things, someone could get a slide deck and think, I can use this, but it might be 3 years old. So just making sure that you're building your documents to be shared and you're answering any questions on the slide that you would be voicing over.
Definitely, thank you. Last two questions. First question, Brian asks, how do you feel about releasing the whole slide versus revealing it one bullet at a time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question, and something I even thought about for this presentation. Like, should I, go bullet by bullet? Because a lot of times, right, if you have a big slide up, your audience could get distracted by reading the slide. But then animation can also distract from your message as well. So I think it's really about finding the balance and figuring out what your audience is going to respond to. I know a lot of times when I have those complex science fair slides, I will use verbal cues to guide the audience. So I know in my presentation, a lot of times I said that green section on the last slide, or let's jump over to the left image first. And just walking your audience through the slide, if you have everything at once, is also going to be very helpful for helping them digest the information.
Definitely. Thanks, Paige. And last question, Andrea asks, during your presentation, do you use notes to remember your narrative for each slide?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it, for me, and probably for all of you, it might vary presentation to presentation. I know, to give some transparency into this presentation, what I did was, especially when I had my PowerPoint open, I had a few notes of the first thing I wanted to say when the new slide came up. So it let me really stay on focus or on track. And in case I would forget what I was trying to say, I had that first sentence there. Sometimes I'll have bullet points of main things I want to cover, but for this type of presentation, that's what I did. And it reminded me and triggered that information I was ready to share.
For sure. Thanks, Paige. And thank you for the question, Andrea. So folks, unfortunately, we are out of time. I know we could go on forever about this topic because obviously it's very important and clearly everyone is very interested in it. But Paige, we really appreciate having you with us today and would like to thank you for providing your expert insights into becoming an effective technical storyteller.
Yep. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all for the great questions, and thank you, Jonathan, for hosting.
And definitely thank you to our audience for those great questions, as Paige mentioned, and for tuning in. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending a short survey to all registrants after this event, and would love your feedback regarding this webinar. We've also included a link to Paige's IEEE USA Insight contributor page, so please check that out. She has a lot of really great articles on career power-ups, career guidance and development, so please check it out, as well as our other articles. Please like and subscribe to our channels and check back daily on our social media for future live stream updates. Have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you.